Hey guys, it's Mr. FS Football here, back with another video. Consider this video to essentially be a continuation of my previous video, which was regarding how we can reverse engineer the game to create better training outcomes for players. Essentially, as a quick summary, in that video, we talked about the idea of training as an adaptation. So you provide a stimulus in your training session, and then your players adapt and essentially get better relative to that stimulus. Um, so in terms of actual training, I propose three essential principles that are required to create stimulating enough practices that create the right adaptations to in-game scenarios. So the first one of those is that the training session has to be position specific for the players. The second is the pressing and passing dimensions. The distances and the intensities have to be similar to in-game scenarios. And then the scanning frequency and quality have to be similar to in-game scenarios. So in that video, I also proposed to look at some of the studies, some of the literature that we have on different training modalities and how they affect physical outcomes and also psychological, tactical, and other various outcomes for players. And so I think I presented that study in the last video. I'll also provide a link in the description below of this video for that study. So I kind of just wanted to start this discussion with one of the quotes, important quotes that I took from that video, and it goes as such. Drills with a low number of players involve more continual activity, and therefore general activity levels are also high. In drills with higher player numbers and concomitantly larger pitch sizes, movement and physical loadings become more position specific. So essentially, what we're saying here is that we have a trade-off between the closer the game in the small-sided games, we have more touches. You have more, I guess, more capability to have physical interactions, and most likely you probably have higher heart rate beats per minute if we're looking at completely solely that metric. But the trade-off here is that it isn't position specific. Whereas in a game, it may not be in the actual 11v11 games that you're playing. There may be a lot more walking. There may be a lot more kind of just light jogs. So the overall distance covered may be higher, but the intensity may be lower. With higher player numbers and larger pitch sizes, simply due to the fact that you're not always going to be engaged in a direct ball actions, but the physical loadings tend to be position specific. So if one of our key principles is position specificity in training, then simply based off that logic, higher player numbers and larger pitch sizes that equate more to 11v11 scenarios would be ideal. So what are the potential solutions? Because this is part two now. I diagnosed the problem in part one. Now it's about giving solutions. Well, the first solution that we can look at is essentially what the NBA does. The NBA is very much known for having players completely revamp and develop their games while they are still professionally active. Perfect examples are players like Kawhi Leonard, who came into the league as essentially just great defenders um, with good verticality and lateral quickness, but they weren't known as great ball handlers, passers, or shooters. Similar with Paul George, or you can look at someone like James Harden, who essentially was at best a good bench player at OKC, a good sixth man of the year, but who once he came to Houston was essentially just one of the greatest offensive juggernauts in the league for years. So all of that revolves around the way that they trained and the specificity of their training that allowed them to create the adaptations that would help them um, to become better players on the court. And another important aspect is that in the NBA, the offseason is a lot longer than in football. If your team doesn't qualify for the playoffs, you essentially have 5 months, the end of April to the end of September, to essentially just work on your game in the offseason. You can really zero in and focus on your weaknesses and your strengths, and essentially just work on your game. And even if your team ends up going to the finals, that all that does is that just adds another 2 months to your season. So you still get the benefit of having 3 months in the off season. So almost all the players have enough time to really focus in and really get better during the offseason. And that's what we find in a lot of the NBA players come back, different physical shapes, different technical capacities, different tactical capacities. Their perception of the game has changed. In a lot of cases, it's very, very interesting to see how players develop in the offseason in the NBA. Obviously, in football, we don't have the luxury of having 3 to 5 months off. And so we rely on different modalities, and that's where Bielsa comes into play. But I think we should first start off with how the NBA looks at player development. And here we look at an example of Paul George in his training in the offseason. I think this is a great illustration of how players are actually training, how basketball players are training in the offseason to get better in actual in-game scenarios, you know. So as we can see here, let me just go back to how the play starts here. So this type of training that they're doing here is essentially it is attempting to mimic the game scenario. What I mean by that is your you have essentially this player here that's essentially acting as essentially just a screener for Paul George, or essentially a passing option for Paul George. And then you have these players in the red here who are acting as defenders. And I think they're going 3v3 here, whereas the actual game is 5v5. But it shouldn't really, it's a negligible difference in this scenario because the focus is on Paul George. Also, you'll notice here that the defenders are holding these kind of props. This is to enhance their length and verticality to make it difficult for Paul George to finish and to replicate in-game scenarios, because in the NBA he's not going to be going up against like 6 foot or 5'10", regular height people. Like he's going to be going up against people. He's 6'9". He might be going to be going up against like 7 footers, 7'3" guys, 6'5", 6'9" guys. So this is also just sort of just like a little important aspect of the training, and I think that's a great thing that the coaches were able to add in to make it difficult for Paul George to get his shots off and to get his passes off. So as we see how this develops, we see here he has to make the read. He he dribbles. It's position specific. He has passing options. He has a double team here. He sees the open man. He has to make that read, and he comes out again for the three. So as you can see, just based off just the eye test here, the actions are very similar and the intensity is very similar to what you would find in a game. I mean, the game of basketball is very similar to soccer. You have or football. You have patterns, and you have to recognize. You have to make the right read, and then make the right play based off that, and use your technique to be able to put yourself in a position to finish off the plays, right? Because technique at the end of the day is at the end of the spectrum, whereas perception is at the beginning. If you don't perceive what's going on around you, you could have the best technique in the world. It won't help you at all because you don't actually understand what's required in that moment. So here, just another example, we see he comes off a screen, um, he gets into a space, his defender is trailing, little miss dribble, finds the open man, he comes across, gets the ball again. It's a good defense there. They're trying to make it as difficult as possible, and then he finishes with a jump shot. So just looking at that action, that is so similar to what you would find in NBA games. So this level of training and this level of detail is really, I think, it's something that's great. And then another thing that I want to add here is, you see also mid-session, one of the head coaches here is actually providing real-time feedback on the court to Paul George based off video footage that they've taken of that training session mid-session, and not even after the session. It's mid-session, so he's telling him the things that he did well, the things that he didn't do well, or different plays that they can work on. I think this is also an invaluable tool that I think obviously is not available to most players, but at the elite level, because it allows them to get real direct feedback during the training session about their performance and how well they're doing and the reads that they're making. And so this just enhances the adaptation for most players. So this was essentially just a case study into Paul George and his off-season work that allows him to become the player that he is during the season, which is essentially an all-star level player, with a top talent, and the sky's the limit for him. Hopefully, him and Kawhi can win a championship this year. So now let's look at Bielsa's method, because this is more specific to our sport. Well, analyzing Bielsa, what I find is that there's two main sort of principles to his training. The first is psychological imprinting. What I mean by psychological imprinting is that he likes to use a lot of unopposed work to work on key movement patterns offensively and defensively that he wants his team to understand. He wants these movement patterns to be completely and utterly ingrained into the minds of his players, so as to so there can be no confusion on the pitch, and to actually it actually frees the mind of the players, because they have to think less about, oh, where are my teammates going to be, what kind of runs they're going to make. They already understand what needs to be done, so it kind of limits, it kind of not limits, but it kind of just decreases the amount of misunderstanding that can happen on the pitch. So there's that level of psychological imprinting. And then, secondly, he tests the player's understanding of the drills and the psychological imprinting that was done in the training by having two 12-minute 11v11 games played at a very high intensity. So 24 minutes in total of 11v11 games every session, or not every session, but most sessions, to be able to put that psychological imprinting into real time. And so we've taken some clips here from his time at Bilbao, the work that he was doing at Bilbao, to kind of just understand, um, to kind of just have a visual representation of the type of imprinting that we're talking about. So I think the first level of imprinting here is offensive. So what they're focusing on here is making third man runs. So basically, what happens is this player plays to this player, and then this player lays it off to this player, who then plays this player into the space. So it's essentially just a very common third man run combination, which is one of the most dangerous actions you can make in football. So let's see how they do it. Uh, Not the best touch there, but good shot. We could look at another example here. Ball gets played. He lays it off. The runner makes the run, and the finish. So that's kind of just an example of the offensive psychological imprinting that he likes to put into his players. A lot of this work is almost all of this work that I've seen from him is just unopposed. He just wants the players to understand the technical and tactical components of this drill, and then later on he's going to test the other perception and psychological and other components through the 12-minute game that they play. So here is essentially just defensive organization drill where it's unopposed. So basically, you have the back line here, and then you have your midfielders here. And what basically is being done here is basically reacting based off their formation that they're playing in, reacting to how the backline will react to different movements depending on where each player is moving into and where the pressure is. So if we can look at an example here, we can see, for example, if this player moves into here, he follows. If this player moves inside, he follows. Right? If this player moves inside, he's following. If this player goes to step, then these two have to collapse internally to keep the shape, and he has to stay tighter to him. If this player moves outward, then they think, and then so it's kind of just. I mean, we can play it a bit more. It's logical. It's essentially just if this person moves there, how does the defensive shape react? It's just ingraining that pattern into players, so it becomes essentially subconscious, or almost, or as subconscious as possible during the game, and they're able to maintain their shape and compactness as a defensive unit. So those are the two main um, psychological imprinting patterns that he likes to use, and then they get into the full 11v11 game. So what they usually do is that they'll have their first game kind of halfway through the session, their first 12-minute game, and then they have their last 12-minute session to kind of just end off the training session. And the training sessions, as you can see, are no more than an hour and a half, so standard time for a training session. So kind of, I'll put the volume up here so you can kind of just hear the intensity and the instructions from Bielsa. You could see here. I mean, this is essentially just the game, the intensity. I mean, if anything, it's even higher intensity because a lot of the times Bielsa likes to go one on one in these type of training games. I think the Leeds United players called this murder ball, but I wouldn't necessarily say this is exactly like the murder ball that they play, but it's very similar. Um, I think in the murder ball that they play, the transitions are much more intense, and yeah. As you can see here, it's essentially just an 11v11 game, but if you could see everybody's man to man, so it becomes very difficult to create space and to find the open man, especially in the midfield. And it's you have to make a lot of movement to be able to be open to receive the ball. And you can see Bielsa in the middle there, just giving instructions to the players. one-on-one situations. I mean, essentially, at the end of the day, I think these types of slide tackle there, these types of this type of training is the one that creates. I think everybody knows this instinctively. This type of training creates the best adaptation for players because if you want to get better at football, 11v11, you have to play 11v11. So I think there isn't much that needs to be said here. It's essentially just a question of the dosage and whether it's possible for other teams to replicate this, whether their players are fit enough to do it. You know, Scanning and everything to making runs up the ball. Like this is just a perfect example of what I was talking about. Like this is just so this player, I think it's Sayeta, he plays the ball in, he continues his run. I mean, if we watch here, just watch here in slow motion how this play develops. You know, just watch Sayeta. Knows the ball's coming right there. Scan. Nothing beats this. This is the perfect example. He scans, perceive, and then this player understands where the space is, and then he makes the run. There's no amount of technique training, there's no amount of drill that can really replicate that understanding between players and that level of perception, that level of scanning, and sort of just those movements, because that's essentially what happens in the game. And then great save by the goalkeeper. Right. So that's Marcelo Bielsa, and then this is kind of just like a quick. I think when Bielsa, a lot of you are familiar with how Bielsa left Leeds. He left the team not in a great way. They're 16th in the Premier League last season, before he left in February, which is essentially just around mid-season. Um, but one thing that I'd like to say is that a lot of the times people didn't consider how many key players were actually injured, and this may actually have to do with the fact that a lot of the times maybe this type of training modality and training with this type of intensity actually creates a high degree of potential injury risk for players. I think that that's a factor that we'll probably consider in the next slide or the next two slides. But with that being said, I think Bielsa really did have a successful tenure at Leeds because if you look at his successor and the failures that he had, it kind of puts things into perspective now, right? Because when a coach isn't doing well and they're close to the relegation zone, it's easy to fire him. It's easy to have that lack of perspective as to what is actually the root cause of the issue. But I think now that we've had a year for the dust to settle from Bielsa's departure, we can clearly kind of paint a picture of what's actually going on at the club. So I kind of just wanted to use this slide to use this comparison in terms of Marsh and Bielsa spending. Bielsa spent 118 million euros in roughly 4 years that he was at Leeds United. That equates to 105 million pounds. And on the other side, Jesse Marsh in essentially just a year has spent 141 million pounds. So that's a $36 million difference. And Bielsa has been coaching that team for 3 years longer than Marsh has. So that's ridiculous if you actually think about it. Um, and in the time that Bielsa's coach Leeds, like the three full seasons that he had with the team, he finished third and first in the championship, got promoted, and then they finished ninth in their first season in the Premier League. And to put that in perspective, they're only 2 points off of Arsenal. Like a big club like Arsenal with all the resources that they have, they're only 2 points off them that season in ninth place. Absolutely brilliant from Bielsa. And then now we look at the fact that Marsh has actually been fired recently. I think it's been a week or two since he's fired. And when Bielsa left the team, they're in 16th place. And currently now, a year later, with Marsh, they're in 17th place. So I have nothing else to say. It's up to you guys to draw conclusions, what you will from that. So, what are the potential drawbacks of this training modality? Essentially, training with a greater degree of spaces and higher player numbers. Um, well, first and foremost, is the injury risk. When you enhance the space, what you're doing is you're putting a greater emphasis on players making runs off the ball, being able to press, being able to compete. Everything just becomes harder on the body physically. It takes a greater physical toll because you have to run more essentially and at a higher intensity. But the one pushback that I will have on that, yes, it does increase injury risk, but as long as you stay in that Goldilocks zone for each player is different, but that Goldilocks zone is essentially what I mean by that is that zone where the player has enough physical stimulation to be able to not get injured. So he's fresh enough to be able to compete on match day, but he's not completely undertrained to the point where there's increased injury risk. Because the thing you need to understand is, okay, by training at a high intensity, it does increase the injury risk, but that's only if the player is not prepared for the amount of sprint and the intensity that's required. If the player is gradually builds up their tolerance and the adaptations to this. So maybe if you do, like, instead of 2 by 12 minute games, maybe 2 by 3 minute games to start off, and then 6 minutes, 9 minutes, and so on, you can create a situation where the players are slowly adapting over the course of the season, and then are actually ready to play 24-minute full field high intensity games during their sessions. So injury risk is one of those things that we can mitigate with great planning. So that's another thing that I just wanted to push back on. But it is essentially a drawback playing high intensity full field games. Like, you are going to get your fair share of injuries. And the second is, for the top teams, they simply don't have enough time to implement something like this. Like, there's just not enough time for them to recover from these types of training sessions for it to actually be valuable. Because at the end of the day, if you don't recover from a training session, there's no point. You're not creating adaptation. There's no point to it, right? Like, for example, you take Manchester City. They're playing, like, this week. They're playing. They played on the Wednesday against Arsenal, and then they're playing again on Saturday. I mean, they're like, they only really have Thursday and Friday, and those days are most likely probably going to be used for video analysis, light training sessions, and recovery for the players that played on Wednesday, right? So I guess the players that didn't play at all on Wednesday against Arsenal can maybe work a little bit harder. Maybe we can get some 11v11 stimulus into them to prepare them. But even then, I mean, when you're talking about 2 3 days turnaround for games, it's completely difficult, and the risk is essentially just too high for the top teams to implement. Teams like Leeds United, they're playing once a week, or teams like Bilbao that are, maybe, let's say, teams that are not in Europe. I think something like this is definitely more feasible. And then lastly is, this type of training requires a great degree of intensity, and a great degree of focus psychologically. Um, I believe some of the monotony of some of the training, just run like some of those defensive drills that I show, and those offensive drills. I feel like players, especially in the day and age of player empowerment, may not view that as exciting enough or a high enough stimulus for them. And there may be pushback, especially in the bigger teams. Like, for example, if you look at this article, headline article that's saying Erling, according to his agent, or his agent, yeah, Erling Haaland could be worth $1 billion. When you're looking at an asset, a player, but that is essentially an asset for these clubs, it's worth $1 billion. Do you really want to run him into the ground by training him at such a high intensity during the training session and risk injuries during the game? I don't know. That's something you're going to have to consider. And you look at the level of influence that Kylian Mbappe is able to exert at PSG. Luis Campos, the sporting director, is a good friend of Kylian Mbappe. He worked with him at Monaco. Is it a coincidence that PSG hires him as their new sporting director? I don't know. That's up to you guys to decide. But I'm pretty sure Kylian Mbappe probably had a say in that hiring. Lionel Messi, of course, we know about the sort of almost dictator-like role that he had in Barcelona, in terms of him having a very high degree of influence over the club, the training methodologies, and also the hiring of coaches, the hiring of players. And so all of these factors essentially play a huge role into potential player buy-in, because this type of training is very high intensity, very draining psychologically in almost all aspects. It's very draining on the players, and if you don't have complete player buying, like Bielsa is able to garner at Leeds United for a couple of years, and he was able to garner at Athletic Bilbao, um, we really need to ask the question of whether it's even worth implementing. So, in the age of player empowerment, this type of training especially in the big teams, is most likely not gonna sit well with a lot of the players, senior players. So that's another factor we need to consider. So yeah, that's it for today. That's all I have for today, guys. Mr. FS football out. Look forward to working on the next video for you guys. I'm not really sure what it's going to be about, but it should be coming out soon enough. Thanks.